HOWWWWWW. How is everyone doing? Hello everyone, DJ Arnish and House. Welcome to another podcast episode, or as some would like to call it, Desperation. In today's episode, we'll be going through some final reminders for the prelim paper tomorrow. I hope that this soothing voice and upbeat background music is reassuring. I figured that it'd be better than hearing my real voice for the intro. There isn't any new content in this podcast, just some argument structures, tips and final reminders. So if we're all ready, let's get rolling.
And here comes the terrible voice again. Hi everyone, hope you all enjoyed the intro. I think it was my best one yet. I think I have a future in DJing, whatever you call it. Today I want to do a quick kind of reminders kind of thing for the prelims tomorrow. Again, there's no new content. It's just going through certain structures, final reminders. I'll go through theme by theme so that you can just do a quick check. I know some of you are specializing in certain topics and all that, so whatever's not relevant for you, I'll try to put a timestamp so that you can just skip to the parts where you find relevant for yourself by the topic that you are specializing in. So, without further ado, let's start out with theme 1. Everything here, these 3 slides that you'll see in this podcast, they are from the syllabus document. Again, there's nothing new. It's just things to remind you about. And also about talking about certain things that are coming up during the consults. And I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page because the consults are individual, but try to do a consolidation, so let's see how that goes. Now, for the first topic on PS, for those of you who are specializing in PS, there are 2 major types of questions. Number 1, it's about analyzing the setup of different forms of government across time, and the second one is to assess the effectiveness of stability, effectiveness of the various actors in guaranteeing stability, most prominently the governments themselves. Now, for the first one, just want to do a broad spread of all the different forces that you could consider in influencing the setup of different forms of governments across time. It might be a single factor given question, it might be a 2-factor given question. It doesn't really matter. These are the range of forces that you might want to consider. So obviously there's, let's start from the beginning, there's decall and the colonial legacy. Then there's the Cold War. There are domestic actors, domestic leaders, and the situations that are happening in the domestic scene. And then there's traditional political culture, patrimonialism, traditional authoritarianism. So these are the major forces that are influencing political development across Southeast Asia. Now, one of the big things that kept coming out in consults was, whether it was a single factor question or a question that had 2 factors. The question that kept coming up was about whether or not there needs to be some sort of comparison. I think that definitely there will be, whether it's a single factor or whether it is a double factor question. Now, for the single factor question, if let's say the question gives you Cold War, one of the more popular questions in the consult package, Cold War, and it's a single factor question, assess the significance of the Cold War in the political development of Southeast Asia. Obviously, the bulk load of the question is going to be focused on that, showing the varied ways in which the Cold War impacted the local political scene. However, you can bring in other factors, other forces, like what I listed just now, up for comparison, because one of the other ways in which you can showcase importance and significance is if you do it in relative terms. So the general rule is this, that whatever you bring in, whatever other alternative force that you bring in, let's say decall or the domestic actors, it is meant to serve a purpose, and that purpose is to reinforce your overall stand that you had with the Cold War. So it's either to reinforce Cold War's significance and importance, or it's going to reinforce Cold War's limited significance and importance. So one of the things that I also want to remind you guys about is when you identify the force, try not to go too much into detail about it, but rather focus on the significance, how it impacted the different forms of government being set up. So let's say the given term is decor. I don't want a huge chunk of what happened during the colonial period. That's not the main focus of the paragraph. That's not the main focus of the essay. I want to know what are the repercussions, what are the consequences on the Southeast Asian political landscape because of what happened during decor. So yeah, it's good to give some detail, paint the landscape of what decor looks like in varied countries, and then show the long-term consequences of that. So, but the focus should be on the impact and not on the description of what happened. Now, with regards to the impact, please take note of the question terms. Impact can be impact on political stability, or impact can be impact on the different forms of governments that arose over time. So be careful of the question focus if it comes out. In deciding whether in deciding the importance or the significance of these forces, do take note of its sustainability or its durability in its influence across time and across context as well. I keep emphasizing this. Southeast Asia is a paper that is centered on the concept of diversity. So I want to see a range of case studies. I want to see you consider time as much as possible, the entire time frame. Another thing that kept coming up for this subtopic in PS was about the role of MPP, mass political participation, as well as constitutional processes. You can see some of these terms, they have appeared in some of the questions, and they appear in the syllabus document as well. So it's within the realm of testing. Again, these are huge terms, but please don't be too worried by them. Don't panic and say, oh, we don't know this. No, look, everything connects to what you already know. What I would suggest is that you see these terms as democratic features. You look at mass political participation, for instance. That is the role of the masses. We always focus our attention on the government and the leadership, but we need to also give the masses some credit and significance, because they play a part in the political process as well. Now, the key question then is going to be about the power dynamics between the masses and the leaders. Are the leaders dependent upon the masses for their power and legitimacy? Or are the leaders using the masses for their own political purposes and consolidation? So I think both the masses and the leaders will play a role, but in terms of the relative significance, that's something that you got to figure out. A lot of it comes down to its impact, the agency of action, power dynamics, and so on. So that's something for you to consider. So MPP and constitutional processes, you link them and you see them as democratic features. And you ask yourself, let's say if the question is assess their role in political stability. So it's just connected to something you already know, which is about whether democratic features align to the contextual needs of the country in that particular time or across time, taking a look at the features provided by democracy against the features provided for by authoritarianism in context. So think about, once again, long-term sustainability, the durability of it, consistency, and so on. And I think that you will get a fair assessment. So it's nothing new. It will connect to something that you know. So don't be too panicked by it if you see it in one of the questions at the A-levels. Now, one of the big things that Okay, maybe I shall go on to the second subtopic for PS, establishing and maintaining political stability. This one is quite straightforward. We are looking at the effectiveness of governments in not only establishing but also maintaining political stability. So once again, there is an element of sustainability. You need the time frame for these kind of things. In fact, you can use the later period events to help you to either establish the sustainability or showcase a collapse in the sustainability. Whatever it is, please make sure that you look at things in context. Sometimes, and this is something, is a unique point to consider. We always talk about authoritarianism. Yeah, it's short-term good, long-term problems, and all that stuff. But one thing to consider is, does the context of the country or the context of that time, does it justify, does it necessitate the use of authoritarianism? And actually, in using authoritarianism, does it generate good outcomes? So that's something to think about. And yeah, so I think that for this topic on political stability, these are some of the things that you want to consider. And yeah. Now, on that note, as I move on to national unity, the other topic in this theme, I want to also talk about context and the justifications for certain types of policies or certain styles of rule. I think those are higher forms of argument that you can consider, because now we have in national unity, a big part of this topic is looking at policy approaches. And we know our two broad categories. We look at integration and we look at assimilation. Now, for assimilation in particular, we have this idea that assimilation is pretty repressive, it's harsh, especially on the minorities and all that kind of stuff. But once again, is there something that we need to consider about the context that justifies, that legitimizes assimilation policies? And in so doing, can we mitigate the criticism of assimilation? Can we rehabilitate it in some way to show that it was justified by the context? Now, linking this idea to what I had in theme 1 just now, with regards to authoritarianism, my thinking is that for high levels of argument again, do you want to consider something of a hybrid situation? So for democracy and authoritarianism, in terms of long-term sustainability, it seemed to me that those that had a good balance of both were able to have deterrence plus also incentivization that created very lasting situations. Same thing here for assimilation and integration. It may not be a black and white situation. A possible higher level of argument you could try for is to look at hybrid situations where countries, because they have a majority group, therefore there is some legitimacy to assimilation, but then they need to balance it out with integration. So hybrid situations might be a way forward in terms of the long-term sustainability there. So that's from the policy approach point of view. The other thing that kept coming up during consults is about the minorities themselves, their responses. Now, one of the big things that kept coming up was about how minority responses and their mentalities are very conditioned by the type of policy that the governments implemented in the country. That is true, and I would say it's true to a large extent. But I think that if you have a minorities responses question, it's quite vital to look at the minorities and their own mentalities by themselves. That means you don't consider government policies first, but by their own agenda, by their own objectives, by their own context, and so on. Could that already have shaped their mentalities? Could that already have shaped their methods and their objectives and so on? So just to draw the biggest and clearest distinction, you have the immigrant minorities and you have the native minorities. Now the immigrant minorities, by their own virtue, by their own accord, they are coming into Southeast Asia in order to create a livelihood for themselves. Their agenda is primarily economic. They have very little political agenda, and they are in an alien host country. So by that, their receptiveness might be higher compared to the native minorities who have been there, for a very long period of time. They are conditioned by traditional hostility with the majority group, and now they are forcibly put into new nations with this majority group. So right from the beginning, their own mentalities and all that, I think it would have already conditioned their approach in some way or another. So yes, a lot of it comes down to how the governments treated them in the new nations, but at the same time, I think it's good to draw a distinction between the minority mentalities by their own accord, by what type of minorities they are, by the nature of their concerns and their objectives. And then the last thing I want to consider also, it's about the policies. Now, for integration and assimilation, these are broad categories of how we can organize national unity policies, social policies. But keep in mind that when you give your examples or when you do, and you can see some of the questions actually give you these things as given factors, you may need to go down into more specific. So we are looking at cultural policies, religious policies, language policies, education policies, economic policies, and even political policies. So the broad head the broad headings can be integration and assimilation, sure, but all these policies are going to be encompassed in both integration and assimilation. So, for instance, you could have religious policies being implemented in different ways. So let's say Singapore, just a simple example, Singapore multiculturalism versus Burma or Thailand with state-imposed Buddhism. So the religious policies could manifest in an integrationist manner. It can manifest in an assimilationist manner as well. That's something for you to consider. Just one final note maybe about the case studies. Now we have assimilationist dominant countries, and they are like Thailand, Burma, Indonesia, Philippines. They are primarily assimilationists, but across time they have known to have introduced integrationist elements. So have they become fully integrationist? I don't think so. Primarily because they still have a majority group and the nation is based on the majority group, justifiably so, I would say. But across time, there have been more concessions. Now, the big thing, and going back to just now what we said, sustainability. These concessions, are they genuine? Are they one-off? Do they tackle the core problems of what the minorities are facing? Is there a genuine attempt at finding a consensus or an accommodation space? So this could work both ways, because if it is, then you can see the situation improving. But if it isn't, then you can see that the situation continues to deteriorate. But this time, as a result also of integrationist policies. That means the integrationist policies here, you could run an argument that they are flawed, that they are problematic, that they are inadequate, and so on. So break the mold that integration equals good, assimilation equals bad. There's no such association. Try to look at things in context, try to find the nuances, and then you can get a higher level of argumentation. So I think that's all I have to offer for theme 1. We have political stability questions, and then we have national unity questions. And now I'll move on to theme 2. Okay, onwards you go to theme 2. I've basically been evicted from every quiet place that I've been in, and now I'm basically outside at a random location along a corridor. So if you see me, hi. If not, then cool. Now let's move on to theme 2. Now for theme 2, for economic development, very, very broad topic. So you can see that the focus is also going to be really broad. We are looking at very, very broad challenges and opportunities across the time frame. We are looking at very, very broad government strategies across the time frame. And we are also looking at very, very broad aspects of the economy through agriculture, industry, and finance. Additionally, we're also considering a number of different actors and agents in the economy. We are looking at the government, we're looking at the other domestic agents, and we are looking at external agents as well. Now, the first objective over here, you can see, analyze the different causal relationships that underpin the different paths to ED, the extent to which they have been effective across different contexts, across time. So, a lot of I think there are two. Again, I think the main thing here that we are focused on is on effectiveness. We are looking at either the effectiveness of agents, or we are looking at the effectiveness of strategies in leading to economic development. Now, first things first, like what we did, what we were talking about for PS and for NU, with regards to economic development, I think one of the big things that came up was to identify the indicators of economic development. Now, one of the things that I would just want to ask you guys to broaden your scope a bit more is that economic development, the indicator, is not everything leading to growth, like economic growth, GDP. I think that we need to look at the different goals by the different contexts and the different objectives that we have across time. So let me give you an example. For the initial period, the goal of many Southeast Asian governments in new nations could be to diversify their economy, or could be to create a modern sector, or could be to industrialize. Now, all these three things actually they converge to mean the same thing. We are looking at a very narrow, commodity-based, agriculture-based economic landscape left by the colonial legacy, and one of the most urgent and priority tasks for governments was to find more avenues of growth and to find more channels. Now, you can see that with my phrasing as well, I would naturally have to come back to growth. But at the same time, we are also looking at the different sectors, the individual ones, and with the setup of those sectors, we can also count them as challenges, and we can also count them as objectives to be fulfilled. So if they do set it up, they kickstart industrialization, they even expand it later on, all these things can be seen as indicators as well. If you want to follow it up by stats, then let's say we are looking at industry, then you would don't just focus on GDP, national income, balance of payments, but you might want to look at the percentage share of manufacture in contributing to GDP, or the percentage share of exports in contributing to GDP in relative to agriculture and in relative to finance, for instance. So one of the big things about the indicators is this: just need you to think about identifying it clearly and keeping it varied so that you can encompass initial challenges all the way to long-term ones. Now, once again, this key concept of change and continuity, or this key concept of sustainability, pops up once again, and that's something that the more you can showcase off inside your essay, I think the better it will be. So that's to do with effectiveness. Now, with regards to the second objective you see over here, the blue box, we will also need to look at importance. Now, with many of our questions on importance, whether it's this topic or any other topic, remember that importance has a different goal compared to effectiveness questions. Now, with importance, there is a bigger chance and a bigger offering for you to use both negative and positive case studies to reinforce a sense of importance. So the key difference here is that for negative case studies, they would not work against your argument, but actually they may help to reinforce your argument. So I think this is another dimension of argumentation that if you can showcase and you can reinforce the point that you're making through a variety of contrasting case studies, I think that would be something that will take your essay up to a level. So With regards to importance questions, the baseline, the foundation, make sure that you look at the qualities, the unique qualities that the governments and the non-state actors, they contribute to economic development. They all contribute in some way and they contribute uniquely. So whether they contribute or not, that's not up for discussion. The main discussion now is about their relative contribution. Who contributes more? Now, same thing, if it's a two-factor question, make sure that the comparison is consistent throughout the essay. If it's a one-factor question, there is also the opportunity for you to bring out the other factor to reinforce the argument in some way. So that's for economic development. Now for Asian financial crisis, we have three different types of question: causes, consequences, responses. Now usually I think the common question is that are they as distinct as they are? Most likely not, probably not. Let's say for instance if I give you a consequences question. Now if I give you a consequences question and I ask, why were some countries more devastated than others? That could require you to look at pre-crisis conditions as well. And if you look at pre-crisis conditions, they would mostly account for the outbreak period and why different countries experience different levels of outbreak and devastation in 97 itself. Then you would also need to consider the responses period, and that could account for what happens after the outbreak period, why there were differing levels of devastation from there. So it's going to be intermixed unless the question really focuses on causes and says like, what caused the AFC, then that one don't really need to bring in responses or consequences. But yeah, just I think read the question carefully and see what kind of breadth you can introduce to the argument. Now for consequences, one of the big things that I want to continually stress is that since this is a economic topic, the bulk load of your consequence should focus on the economic consequences. And to add on to that, you would also need to consider the spillover effects into the social and political spheres. So while you can consider these three different aspects, I think that the focus should be on the economic devastation. And anyway, also because the political and social side, there aren't many case studies for that. You kind of only have two to showcase social unrest and political change. Now, on this note, something to do with argumentation, and I think the AFC topic highlights this the most. Now, make sure that your overall argument is supported, and more importantly, your overall argument isn't contradicted. So, what do I mean by that? Now, if your stand is I largely agree, or the dominant trend is in Southeast Asia is like that, but it is only supported by 3 case studies, and then you have 2 exception case studies. Now that doesn't really make sense because the balance is quite even, and your main argument doesn't really showcase dominant trends. So I think one of the big things across all topics is to look at dominant trends. And if you do run an argument on dominant trend, then you have to make sure that the argument is well supported by a bulk load of case studies. And if you run an exception, then the exception is really like exceptional. 1, maximum 2 in other topics. For AFC, confirm, I think if you want to run an exception, it's going to be 1. Now, for exception paragraphs, what is the focus of exception paragraphs is to explain why they are exceptions, why they go against the trend, what's unique about them, and things like that. So a lot of the exception paragraph isn't just to showcase the evidence that, let's say, Singapore is different. It's about explaining why Singapore is different. So like earlier on in the political stability section, I did mention that you must have a right focus for your paragraphs. Don't give me too much description. Make sure that you focus on the significance of the case studies that you're bringing up and the significance of certain factors that make them exceptional or that run your main argument. Now, with regards to the last bullet point that you see over here, responses to the AFC by governments and ethnic communities. Now, again, don't be too worried about this ethnic communities component. How do ethnic communities respond to the AFC? Well, I think for this, you can do in two ways. Number one, you can relate these ethnic communities to the non-state sectors. So you're looking at banks, you're looking at the manufacturers, the exporters themselves. You just have to link that to the ethnic communities as non-state. Because it's a bit hard for me to identify what is a Chinese industry or what is an Indian or what is a Thai industry and so on. So I just need you to relate it to the sectors and look at it from that angle. The second thing that you can do with regards to ethnic communities, if you do have specific examples of their actions and their responses, then I think that's something that you can bring up. So for instance, in Indonesia, it's very evident for me to see that the ethnic majority of Indonesians, they reacted really badly to the economic devastation, and then they began a witch hunt against the Chinese and so on. Caused a lot of social unrest, caused a lot of political instability as well. So that's something that you can zoom in down to one specific ethnic community. And if you have cases like that, then it'll be good to surface, and then you pair that up with what I mentioned earlier just now about the non-state sector and how they responded to the Asian financial crisis. So I think that's about it for theme 2. Hopefully that will give you some reminders about argument strategies and focus and all that kind of stuff. And now we'll move on to theme 3. Okay, now for theme 3, it's basically just going to be about two things. Either going to be about interstate tensions and conflict and cooperation, or it's going to be about ASEAN-related matters. Now, for the first one, it's quite simple in terms of question types. You are either going to get the causes or the consequences of interstate tensions and cooperation. Now, part of the causes question type, you might get something to do with the nature of the conflict. Now, with regards to the nature of the conflict, there's a number of things that you can explore. I mean, it could be what is the core issue of the conflict. So nature just means, what's the characteristics. Now, for causes and nature, when we look at the issue, the core issues of the conflict, what we're looking at is things like, is it down to security, sovereignty, historical dimensions, the personality of leaders, economic disputes, and so on. So finding out what the core nature of the issue is, I'm pretty sure to every conflict there are a number of dimensions, but the job for you is to look at the sources and to see what seems to be the core issue as presented by the different authors over there. With regards to consequences, we are looking at what are the consequences arising from interstate tensions, how easy is it to resolve, what are the factors accounting for that, and what are the things that the government seem to be doing, and how effective are they in trying to resolve their interstate tensions. A big thing about this subtopic as well is about areas of responsibility. So you're looking at different nations, different parties, different disputants, and you're trying to ascertain relative responsibility. Once again, both parties would probably be at fault in some way or another, but we are looking at the relative responsibility of each of these parties. Now, for ASEAN, we look at a number of topics, starting from the formation itself. Same thing, what led to the formation, what is the character of ASEAN, what were the key motivations, and what's the relative importance of each of them. The other things we looked at, the two big fields that we are looking at in terms of ASEAN's management is about peace and security in the region, as well as economic development. So peace and security, we looked a lot at it. We looked at the application of ASEAN Way principles in the various conflicts. We looked at their relationship to the external powers and whether or not it was one of dependency or whether it is part of their diplomatic strategy. Actually, it's quite similar to economic cooperation as well. Remember when we went through the tutorials, we looked at 3 decades of ASEAN and regional economic integration. Very simply, to categorize it, we look at the first decade where no action, no initiation, therefore also no outcomes, nothing significant over there. Then the second decade where we start to see some actions and some outcomes, but not really very sustainable and actually quite marginal. At this point, the first and second decades, we can account a lot for this by looking at the national economies, because at this stage, many of them are still competitive by nature and they see each other as an economic threat. Also, there are major political concerns that are going on right now, and it's a source of distraction. Their priorities lay somewhere else. So there isn't a lot of momentum, there isn't a lot of currency behind these first 2 decades of economic initiatives. But going into the third decade, we can see many things shift. The domestic landscape shifts, the economic landscape shifts, the global landscape as well also shifts. And we start to see the formation of larger multilateral economic organizations, of which ASEAN is either a key player of, or they in fact are the ones that are leading and initiating the formation of such economic organizations. Now, for the third decade, I think the 2 biggest case studies we have are APEC as well as AFTA. For APEC, I think it's about the integration of Southeast Asian nations in the wider Asia-Pacific community. Fairly successful. The main objective here is look at establishing economic interdependence across countries, trade links, networks, investment, FDIs, all that kind of stuff. So trying to foster as much interdependence as possible. I think with regards to AFTA, it might be even more significant considering that this is an ASEAN initiative and it is on a very large scale. Looking at free trade, so once again, it is a liberalization process. This time round, it is on the regional scale, looking at integrating economies, fostering interdependence. One of the big things about AFTA, the free trade component to it, is that there is a timetable. So if you look at your notes, you can see that there is this thing called CEPT scheme, the CEPT tariff scheme. So basically, and besides the CEPT tariff scheme, you can see that there are these things called the inclusion and the exclusion list. Inclusion and exclusion list. So long story short, what all these things are about is about having a timetable towards free trade. They don't want to jump at it overnight, and also it must be on a voluntary basis. From the nations involved, it must be a voluntary basis. Remember the key principle of non-interference. So what this CEPT list basically means is that the nations who are in AFTA, they will put up certain goods and services that they offer into the inclusion list. Now this inclusion list is going to be up for free trade and is going to stimulate the movement of these goods and services across the region. And you can be very attractive, you can foster growth and all that kind of stuff because you don't have to pay taxes associated with import and export duties and all that kind of stuff. That's the inclusion list. Now for the exclusion list, this is trying to be fair to countries because certain countries, they have certain items or goods that are very valuable to them, and at the point in time, they cannot put these goods up for free trade. So what they do is that they just put it on the exclusion list, which means that it's not up for free trade at the moment, and everyone kind of respects that list as well. But ASEAN continually tries to encourage nations to move the goods and services in the exclusion list into the inclusion list. So to foster greater free trade and liberalization in the region as well as integration among the member countries. Another thing to consider is that for AFTA, it also coincides with the period of expansion of ASEAN. In 1995, 1997, 1999, there are newer ASEAN members that are joining the organization, and this AFTA inclusion and exclusion list would apply to them as well, but there are many safeguards. So they look at it from the newer members' point of view as well. That the newer members are not as developed and so on, so they give them more time in order to build up their capacity for free trade. So their inclusion list and their exclusion list is catered to them, plus also that their timetable can be stretched. It can be a bit longer considering their economic standing and their circumstances. So a lot of this, it comes down to negotiation, and a lot of this you can see it's consultative, it's consensus, it's based on non-interference as well. So that's something to consider. And yeah, I think that with regards to ASEAN, I think that that's the big kind of issues to consider. Remember, whatever comes out, I think that if an ASEAN SPQ comes out, you can, even if you don't know anything about the topic, don't panic. You can always rely on ASEAN Way principles to drive the CK. Remember, now CK, what is CK brought in to do? CK is either brought in to confirm certain trends. Like let's say South China Sea conflict, to confirm, okay, let's say the sources show you what's happening in 92, 95, 97. And then CK, you want to bring in something else that happened in 99. That's to confirm a certain trend, a consistency of ASEAN's effectiveness or ineffectiveness. That's one way to use CK. The second way to use CK is to explain things, and this is where the ASEAN way comes in. Let's say the sources give you the trend. So the sources give you South China Sea from 92 all the way to 2000. They give you the trend, and there's nothing really else to supplement the trend. So what can you do? You can bring in CK like the ASEAN way to explain why is this trend surfacing, explaining the reasons behind this trend. I think that's something that you can bring in for CK as well. So don't worry. My main point in all the themes that I talked today is that everything already connects to something that you know. So don't panic, take 20 seconds, just pause and consider the different questions, the different sources. Just, try to connect it to what you already know. You probably already know everything. I've covered everything. There are notes everywhere. So you are ready for this. Just, calm yourself down, compose a bit, take 20 seconds, say that, you rock and you're awesome and stuff like that. Psych yourself up and stuff. And I think you can rock this shit out, man. Like nothing new, nothing surprising. It is a fair paper, and I think that you guys can do it. And as I told you during lecture, I think my expectations are quite high for you guys because I can see your capacity, I can see your improvement. So my expectations are quite high in terms of I want to see improvement from the mid-years. So all the best, guys, and I believe in you. Let's rock this shit out.